Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the fourth lecture, the first this year, of the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre's public lecture series. I am John Blacksland, a member of the staff at SDSC, and I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. It's great. That's a great tradition we do here at the university. I'd like to thank you all for coming along this evening. It's great to have people be here in person, and it's really great that people are making the effort to do so. Before I introduce our esteemed guest speaker tonight, I'd like to take a few moments to acknowledge and thank the late Professor Brendan Sargent, who passed away recently. It's because of him that we have this series of lectures, and this really is intended to help stimulate public discussion on major challenges relating to Australia's strategic and defence policy, and to contribute to the vital national conversation about Australia's future in the Indo-Pacific. He's been a valued colleague, a mentor and a friend to me personally and to many of us, not just at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, but across Canberra and beyond. He was a wonderful teacher to many of the students who are here today, and I know some of them who have personally benefited from his counsel, from his insights, from his very heartwarming personal touch. It's extraordinary, a man, a senior bureaucrat like that, who was able to maintain the human touch. And he really had it. Brendan first joined the university in 2018 as the principal of the Military and Defence Studies program. Before he was appointed as Professor of Practice at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, he took over from me when I went to go and work on the ASD history, and the rest of that is history, of course, but we won't dwell on that. Not too much anyway. And then he became a Professor of Practice at the ANU, and he came to us having already celebrated a remarkable career in the Department of Defence and elsewhere in the public service, reaching the level of Deputy Secretary for Strategy, and then as Associate Secretary of the department and acting as the Secretary of the department for a number of months there, and a lead contender for the appointment that was actually filled eventually by Greg Moriarty. He was also the author of the 2013 Defence White Paper. So White Papers is something that heads of SDSC, present company accepted, have been lead authors of, and we've got another one in the room, Hugh White, here today, of course, as well. But those who would like to attend, there will be a memorial service for Brendan on Saturday at 2 p.m. at Llewellyn Hall, and there is an Eventbrite link for that event if you would like to join us. So, thank you, Brendan. And thank you for coming, everybody, for tonight, because this evening we are privileged to have Emeritus Professor Hugh White, who will offer his view of the similarities and differences of the new Cold War with China and how far this is to the old one against the Soviet Union. Today's policies in Washington, Canberra and elsewhere are based on specific views of both the similarities and differences, views that underpin the prevailing optimism about how the contest will play out and who will win. In this lecture, Hugh will offer a different view, which suggests that optimism about what he describes as this new Cold War is in fact misplaced. Hugh White is Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. His work focuses primarily on Australian strategic and defence policy, Asia-Pacific security issues and global strategic affairs, especially as they affect Australia and the Asia-Pacific. He served as an intelligence analyst with the Office of National Assessments, now the Office of National Intelligence, as a journalist with the Sydney Morning Herald, on the staff of the Defence Minister Kim Beazley, and then the Prime Minister Bob Hawke, and as a senior official in the Department of Defence, where from 1995 to 2000, he was Deputy Secretary for Strategy and Intelligence, and as I read the records, several times acting Defence Secretary as well, particularly in the days of the East Timor crisis, when I was a little bit wet behind the ears up in Townsville, and then doing other things like that. He then went on to found the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and he was the principal author of Australia's 2000 Defence White Paper. Ladies and gentlemen, a lot of that you probably already knew. I have hopefully whetted your appetite. What should be a fascinating presentation. Hugh, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John. And thanks to Michelle and Kian for bringing us all together here. And how nice it is to be together in a room like this. Apart from a quick talk I gave a couple of weeks ago, this is the first time I've spoken in front of a proper live audience for 2 years. So I look a bit nervous and uncertain of myself, you know. Anyway, but let's say thank you all for coming. Look, like John, I just want to say a very few words about Brendan Sargent. He was, of course, as you'll have gathered from our biogs, a colleague, close colleague in defence for many years, as well as a colleague here at ANU. And although I loved my time in defence, and I really did, and I loved my colleagues, it would be fair to say that a disproportionate number of the people you work with in defence, apart from the military officers, are either accountants or engineers, and they're two very fine professions, and I wouldn't say a word against them. But when one came across Brendan in the room, a colleague of immense learning and culture and grace and charm and wisdom, there was always a sense of a breath of fresh air, as well as a fresh and very important perspective on whatever you're doing. And his loss is a great loss to all of us who knew him, to SDSC and ANU and to the Australian strategic policy community at a time when we need all the help we can get. And it's also a kind of a shocking reminder of the fragility of things we take for granted, including our friends and colleagues. So, of course, it's not the only reminder we've had in the last little while about the fragility of things we take for granted. Because when Brendan and I discussed this talk and this topic, there was really one Cold War we were talking about, potential new Cold War, and now there were two. And that does change the dynamics a bit. Or maybe there's one Cold War with two fronts. I'm going to try and explore that topic a bit. So I don't want to abandon my topic, but on the other hand, it would be superhuman and kind of stubborn not to talk a little bit about the elephant. Well, perhaps the elephant's not in our room, it's in somebody else's room, but the big new issue. And so I'm going to say a few words about how I see the connection between the strategic crises that I see with us in East Asia that constitutes that Cold War, the Cold War in my topic, and the strategic crisis in Eastern Europe. And then I'll also return at the end to say a little bit about how I think the implications of all this connect. So let me just start by saying a little bit about the interconnections, as I say, between the strategic crises that we face in East Europe and in East Asia today. And I use that term very deliberately. I do think we face strategic crises of a very high order in both ends of Eurasia, if I can put it that way. Those two crises are separate, but they are connected. They both constitute together and separately a crisis in the post-Cold War global order that we've all grown pretty used to now, because it's nearly 30 years old and most of us have loved it. And we've got, what we have is two separate but connected crises in two separate parts of the world in the one global order that came into being at the end of the Cold War. That order was based ultimately, but very directly, on US strategic primacy, US global strategic primacy. This is a big subject. I'm just going to say one sentence about it, but it's always been my view that a strategic order of whatever scale, global or regional, is defined by the issues upon which great powers believe they're willing to go to war with one another over. So in the continent of Europe in the 19th century, the strategic order was defined by the fact that the great powers were all willing to go to war with one another to make sure that none of them became hegemonic in Europe and hence globally. In the Cold War, the order was defined by the fact that both superpowers were willing to go to war with one another and believed that they were willing to go to war with one another to avoid the other gaining a significant advantage and disturbing the status quo. And the defining feature of the post-Cold War order was that the United States convinced everyone and believed themselves that they were willing to go to war to sustain their global supremacy and to support the order that had been built on their vision of how the world should work and their values and so on. And just to be crystal clear, that was a really good order. It really worked, I think, for the vast bulk of humankind. It certainly worked very well for Australia. But it was welcomed by for a very large proportion of the world. But in order for that to be sustained, it was necessary for countries around the world to accept that it was underpinned essentially by military power. Military power is the muscle beneath the skin, and we often don't see the muscle beneath the skin in an international order when it's working well, because it doesn't have to be used. It's a bit like the sort of the concealed firearm that the policeman carries. You don't see it when it doesn't have to be used, but it's there and it underpins the order they sustained. And it was, but the fact that it was welcomed did require everyone to accept US primacy. And that meant that every country in the world had to relinquish for themselves the status of a great power. Now, one could talk for a week about what I mean by the status of a great power, but to try and put it succinctly, the way I see things, a great power is a power that has the capacity to shape the way the international system of which it's a part works. And what we kind of had to relinquish, all of us, was to the United States, was that status as a great power. Now, that was actually pretty easy for most of us to do. It was easy for countries in the West. It was easy for the countries of Europe. It was easy for countries like Japan, certainly for countries like Australia. We got used to US leadership during the Cold War, and we respected and admired it. And it worked very well for us. And it kind of fitted with an ideology that power politics was a thing of the past. And there were a lot of countries in the world who didn't like it as much as we did, but who tolerated it, partly because they didn't have much choice, and partly because they did also recognise, although they were perhaps less enthusiastic about it than we in the Old West were, that it worked for them. And I think, for example, I mean, a lot of parts of the world are characterised this way, but Southeast Asia, I think, is broadly characterised that way. But it has been resisted by some. Now, those who have resisted it have not challenged the United States for global leadership, but they have sought to challenge the United States leadership in their own regions. They've sought great power status in their own region. And they've sought, in order to do that, to minimise or exclude US influence in their region and establish a sphere of influence of their own. That's one of the hallmarks of a great power. You seek to exclude other great powers from your immediate neighbourhood, and you seek a sphere of influence of your own. And you also seek equality with other great powers, in this case with the United States, at the global level. You don't seek to dominate the United States at the global level, but you do seek to function at a level of equality with the United States at the global level. And a country that seeks that status is fundamentally challenging the US-led order, the US-led global order of the post-Cold War world, because it disturbs the position of the United States and it disturbs the position of US regional allies. US regional allies who are accepting US global primacy require the United States to function as the only great power in their own regions, because if another country does start acting like a great power, then they need to start acting like a great power. If you look at Japan's predicament, for example, it was fine for Japan to accept that it was not a great power in East Asia and accept that America was a dominant power because there were no other great powers, and the United States was going to keep any other great power, any would-be great power under control. But as soon as another great power, a country does arise as a great power, then Japan thinks, oh, is this working for me anymore? Or you can apply the same logic, of course, to Europe, and it doesn't require a lot of imagination to do that right now. So all those countries around the world who are happy not being great powers and subcontracting the shaping of the international order to the United States, they are happy to do that as long as everyone else did the same thing. But when others start to violate it, it fails to work for everyone. Now, there have been three of these significant great power challenges to the US-led global order in their separate regions over the last decade. Iran in the Middle East, and one could talk a lot about that. The challenge in the Middle East actually seemed a very significant one for a while, but once one starts seeing challenges in even more important parts of the world, like Europe and East Asia, the Middle East tends to drop away, and I'm going to move past. I won't talk about Iran anymore. The other two challenges, of course, are China and Russia. Neither, seems to me, can credibly bid for global power against the United States, to compete with the United States at the global level, to seek to become what the United States has been and take America's place at the global level. But both can and are challenging the United States in their regions. And of course, they have a clear benefit in cooperating. Both seek to reassert their position as great powers in their own regions. Both seek to exclude the United States from their immediate regions. Both seek to establish a sphere of influence in their regions. And those challenges were kind of latent in the 90s, became a little bit more clear in the 10s, and became totally, I think, fully overt in the years around 2008 and 2010. One can unpick the chronology a bit. It's quite interesting to see how closely parallel the Russian and the Chinese challenge became overt. With Russia, of course, the high points are the Russian incursion into Georgia, of course, the seizure of Crimea, and what we're seeing today. With China, that we can see the beginnings of that with some more politically around the Chinese response to the global financial crisis, to the beginning of serious Chinese pressure in the South China Sea, the beginning of serious Chinese pressure in the East China Sea. And so we've seen, and now, of course, with Russia, we've seen that challenge take a whole new dimension in Ukraine. Now, the aim of both of them is to show that the United States cannot back its claim to primacy in their regions with armed force. In other words, the US is not willing to fight to stop them building their own spheres of influence. And by doing that, to undermine the credibility of the United States as a power in their region, and to build their own, to assert their own status as a great power in their region. And what Putin has done in the last few months, in some ways, and days, obviously, has taken a huge step forward. It's the first time that a major power has used, since the end of the Cold War, has used armed force to test America's ability to sustain its claim to global primacy by military force. And of course, the big question is whether Taiwan is next, whether Xi Jinping is emboldened to try and do in relation to Taiwan precisely what Putin has tried to do in relation to Ukraine. So that brings us back to East Asia. And my attempt to frame this around the concept of, is this a new Cold War? America recognised China's challenge very clearly from the end of 2017, when the US National Security Strategy of December 17 just defined China, and for that matter Russia, in the same paragraph, as a strategic rival. That's what they meant by that phrase. And the Cold War analogy surfaced almost immediately. And the use of the analogy between the contest that was emerging between the US and China in East Asia and the Cold War was not just a matter of lazy columnists and, for that matter, lazy academics trying to find an easy way to explain what was going on. Because historical analogies do have great power and great significance. A great power for good. I mean, in the end, the only tools we can use to understand what on earth is going on around us is to try and draw on historical analogies, and I do it a lot myself, and I would never knock it. But historical analogies can also be very deceptive and very misleading. They can be used to short-circuit debates. They can be used for political advantage. They can be used as political clubs. And they can prejudice more serious analysis of what's going on, because it's too easy to say, okay, this situation is just like that situation. What we do now should just mirror what we did then. And that's only right to the extent to which the historical analogy is very close indeed. And as Mark Twain famously said, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. And the rhyme is helpful, but no two situations are the same. And we can see the way in which the Munich metaphor, for example, that every time a rising power is trying to do something we don't want it to do, we liken it to what happened in 1938 with Hitler, which has led us to some very foolish policy decisions in Suez in 1956, in Vietnam in the mid-1960s, in the invasion of Iraq even. And so I think it's very important that when we see these historical analogies appear, we're very cautious about how far we accept them and how far we don't. But we can also use them, as I said, to unpack the similarities and differences, and we learn something about the situation we face today by exploring the similarities as well as the differences from what's gone before. And of course, the Cold War analogy with the contest with China is irresistible in the sense that it is, and the first time since the end of the Cold War, that we see strategic rivalry between the United States and another major power. And of course, the fact that that power happens to be communist does just add to the sort of colour of the thing. But I think it's a misleading analogy, or the analogy is misused in two different ways. Sometimes it's misused by those who support the analogy, who say it is like the Cold War. This is a new Cold War. And they use that to shortcut, in the way I just described, to shortcut debate about what's at stake and how hard we should fight. We all know about the Cold War. Everything was at stake. We pushed like mad, and we won. So if this is just like the last Cold War, if this is a Cold War again, then all of those same things apply. And that's a bad idea, because we have to go back and analyse much more carefully what really is at stake in the contest with China. And how hard should we really push? And what are our chances of winning? But there's also, I think, misleading, this also leads to a misleading debate by those who say that it's nothing like the Cold War. Because that proposition is often used to imply that the costs and risks involved in the contest are much lower, that we don't need to worry about it so much. This is all going to be fine. It's not going to be fine because we're going to win the way we did with the Cold War. It's going to be fine because the whole thing's just going to drift away. And that's a very dangerous proposition as well. Overall, I think the Cold War analogy, the Cold War metaphor, has encouraged the assumptions that this is not too bad, that either it's like the old Cold War and we're going to win it, or it's not really like the old Cold War and it doesn't really matter. Whereas I think it really matters, and it's going to be really hard. So let me just try and pick out some of the ways in which I think the Cold War analogy works and some of the ways in which I don't think it does. How is the US-China contest in East Asia like the Cold War, and how is it different? And how reassured or alarmed should we be by the similarities and differences? Well, let me just start by very quickly listing some of the obvious ways in which it is just like the Cold War, in which it's not like the Cold War. The first is, of course, that people always point out too, is that during the Cold War, the Soviet world and the West were almost completely separate economically, whereas today the economic integration is like that. The second is that the integration is not just economic but social and human. There's enormous connectivities at every level between China and the West, between China and the United States, including a huge amount of people movement. The third is that the contest today lacks the sharp ideological edge of the Cold War between capitalism and communism. Now, there is a sort of a question about that in some people's mind, and I think it's an issue that's interesting to discuss. But as a broad proposition, I think that's right. I don't think what we're seeing here is a clash of ideologies. I think it's much more a traditional clash of power political ambitions. And the fourth way in which it's obviously different is that China doesn't have a bloc the way the Soviet Union did. The Soviet Union led a big group of nations, relatively powerful nations, some of them. And China doesn't. China is much more alone. And there are significant ways in which the Cold War today is not like the old Cold War, and the ones that are often cited in the debates you see in the literature. The less obvious, but I think in some ways more important way in which the analogy is obviously incorrect is that China's aims are very different from, I think, China's aims are very different from the Soviet aims. The Soviet Union, at least at the start, really did aim to dominate the world. And that, and in a way that I'll touch on a bit later, that was not an impossible, not a wholly implausible objective for the Soviet Union to have. And so it really was a rival for the United States for global hegemony. China, I don't believe, is that. And again, I'll explain why I think that in a little while. But China's ambition is to become the dominant power in East Asia and the Western Pacific. That is itself a very radical, very significant, and in many ways very disturbing ambition, but is not the same as trying to dominate the world. If to the extent that China has a global ambition, it is the ambition to be at least an equal with the United States on the global stage. I don't see evidence that China actually wants to rule the world. And in broad terms, all of those differences that I've just listed are kind of reassuring. That's on the reassuring side of the thing. Okay, this is going to be manageable. It's not going to be so hard. But there are a whole lot of other differences which I think are much less reassuring. The first is that the contest between the US and China is much more equal than the contest between the US and the Soviet Union for a simple, really important reason, and that is that China's economy is as big as America's, functionally. And it's important to remember that on its best day, the Soviet economy was never more than about half the size of America's. It was the second biggest economy in the world, which is also worth remembering, but it was only half the size of America's. And the fact that China is, relative to the United States, much more powerful than any rival the United States has ever faced before is a very significant difference and a very scary one. The second difference, which is not reassuring, is that although China has no allies, it has a lot of friends. Well, friends. Has a lot of customers. And they count as friends, actually. I mean, we're seeing an interesting demonstration at the moment as just to how deep those economic links go for a country like Russia. But I don't think we should never underestimate how significant China's enormous role in the global economy is in underpinning its diplomatic and, in the long term, its strategic position. And that's very different from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had a bloc, and some of those, and at times, for example, when it had China in its bloc, or some of the countries in Eastern Europe, they were significant strategic assets, but had very few friends, no friends really. And I think China's position is therefore much stronger than the Soviets was. The next unreassuring difference is that compared to the Cold War, the objectives of the two rivals in the US-China contest in East Asia are much more asymmetrical. Now, I said a minute ago that that at the beginning, at least, of the Cold War, the Soviet Union was trying to achieve world domination. But actually that passed pretty quickly when it discovered what a serious rival the United States was. And I think for the bulk of the Cold War, the core objectives of both sides was to preserve the status quo. The United States wanted to make sure the Soviet Union's influence didn't grow any bigger than it already was, and the Soviet Union wanted to make sure that America's influence didn't grow any bigger than it was. They wanted to preserve their respective global spheres of influence that they carved out for themselves at the end of the Second World War and in the early years of the Cold War. And they both had quite a lot invested in that objective because the status quo that they were both trying to protect gave them equal status. There were two superpowers. They were seen by one another as having equal status. And in the process, each accepted the other's sphere of influence. It is important to remember this. Spheres of influence, Lincoln in Melbourne just last month talked about how spheres of influence are a terrible thing and shouldn't be countenanced. Well, for any American statesman to say that, given that they've exercised a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere since 1824, is a bit cheeky. But the fact is that it's not just that they claimed their own sphere of influence, they recognised Russia's Soviet sphere of influence. That's what they did at Yalta. And they didn't like it. But if we look at the history of the Cold War, repeatedly, when the Soviets did bad things in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, the United States bitched and moaned, but in the end said, okay, that's your part of the world, you do what you want to do. And the contrast with East Asia today is very stark, because in East Asia today, the United States does not accede to acknowledge China as having a sphere of influence. In fact, the US strategic objective in East Asia, to the extent that one can see one, is to deny China the sphere of influence that it's trying to build. And so, whereas during the Cold War, the two superpowers had a very symmetrical set of objectives, they were each trying to preserve a status quo that they both broadly accepted. And their aim was to try and make sure that the other didn't upset it. In the contest between the US and China in Asia today, China is trying to get something that the United States is denying it. And that makes China much more dissatisfied than the Soviet Union was for the bulk of the Cold War, and therefore makes it more resolved, and therefore a more dangerous adversary. The third difference, and it flows from that second one, is a difference in the clarity of resolve on both sides. One of the most distinctive things about the Cold War, and the reason we call it the Cold War and not World War III, because it never went hot, was that both superpowers were extremely cautious about the use of armed force against one another, because both, put it the other way, neither doubted the resolve of the other. One of the most distinctive things about those long, scary decades is that when all was said and done, and there were a few bad days in the office, Berlin a couple of times, Cuba obviously, but most of the time, both sides were absolutely convinced that if the other one, that if they pushed their tanks across the Iron Curtain, across the line down the middle of Europe, they would be in a war and the war would go nuclear. They didn't doubt that the other side would fight. And that was immensely stabilising. The fact that both sides had a very high confidence in the resolve of the other meant that neither side was at all tempted to try anything on. And that was a very significant and very, in retrospect, we can see a very reassuring part of what made the Cold War, in the end, in a weird way, the peaceful order it was. And that's particularly notable on the part of the United States. The fact that the United States could convince the Soviet Union that it was willing to fight to defend Berlin in a war that everyone knew we're pretty sure, would quickly escalate to a nuclear exchange, and that nuclear exchange could include devastating nuclear attack on the continental United States. The fact that the United States could convince the Kremlin that they are willing to fight that war is a pretty remarkable thing. And it was a major achievement of US statecraft. If they hadn't convinced the Soviets of that, then it's very likely that the Cold War would have ended very differently from the way it did. And it's particularly notable because, of course, that proposition is so contrary to what one should, I think, still legitimately see as a fundamental tenet of American statecraft, and that is that being a continent that dominates, being continental power that dominates its own hemisphere, which is guarded by two very broad oceans, isolationism comes very naturally and is a very sensible policy. The reason why the United States succeeded in convincing the Soviet Union of its resolve was that they convinced the Soviet Union that Americans believed that even in their own hemisphere with those broad oceans on either side, a Soviet Union that dominated, for example, that came to dominate Western Europe would come to dominate Eurasia, and any country that dominated Eurasia as a whole could threaten the United States despite the inherent security of its geographical endowment. And of course, the United States was right to fear that. The Soviet Union, particularly early in the Cold War, had the capacity to dominate Eurasia because the other countries in Eurasia were small and weak. Were weak, even if they weren't small. There was China, a very poor country, and of course, for the first portion of the Cold War, a Soviet strategic asset. There was India. There was Western Europe at the beginning of the Cold War, flat on its back, devastated by World War II. The Soviet Union was by miles the strongest power in Eurasia, and without US support, its capacity to dominate Eurasia was pretty clear. And so it was quite easy, that being true, for the United States to persuade the Soviets that the Americans regarded their security at home in the Western Hemisphere as depending on defending Berlin, and therefore that they were willing to fight that kind of devastating war in order to do so. Now, in East Asia today, that's much less clear. I think the United States strongly believes that that China understands its resolve. And I think there's a kind of assumption in the United States that its resolve is strong. But if you look at the fundamental foundations of that resolve, why would the United States have to fight to defend Taiwan, say, the way the United States had to fight to defend Berlin? The rationale looks much weaker, and the rationale looks weaker because the United States' security is not nearly as badly affected by a China which ends up dominating Taiwan or goes on, as it easily could, to dominate East Asia and the Western Pacific, as it would have been by a Soviet Union that went on to dominate Western Europe and then went on to dominate Eurasia. Because no matter how well the Chinese do in East Asia and the Western Pacific, even if they achieve domination over that very substantial area, it can't go on to dominate Eurasia. Because although China is very strong relative to the United States compared to the Soviet Union, it's weaker relative to the other countries in the system. Compared to India, compared to Russia, compared to Europe, China is not as strong as the Soviet Union was compared to the other countries in Eurasia during the Cold War. And so the chances of China dominating Eurasia are much lower, and the chances of China being able to threaten the United States is therefore lower. The imperative for the United States to prevent China dominating East Asia and the Western Pacific is therefore lower. And that doesn't just weaken America's imperatives, it undermines the credibility of its resolve in Beijing. Which gets me back to the point that the clarity of resolve on both sides, which was such a critical part of what kept the Cold War stable, is much weaker in this new Cold War than it was during the old one. And the last point which flows from that, the last difference which is unreassuring, is the relative weakness of the United States' actual response to the challenge from China. Because if you go back and look at what the United States did in the first decade of the Cold War, for example, compare it with what the United States did, or even the first 5 years of the Cold War, compare it with what the United States done in the years since 2017 when it declared China a strategic rival. Well, I don't think it really measures up. In the first 5 years of the Cold War, the United States built NATO. It built its alliance structure in the Western Pacific, including Australia. It deployed massive US forces to Europe and Asia. And it drove defence spending through the roof. And it kept defence spending high. It's important to remember. In the 50s and 60s, US defence spending moved up and down between 8 and 10% of GDP. 8 and 10% of GDP. At that level, the Cold War really was a war. The spending was unbelievable. It's kind of more sobering to note that it was 4.9% of GDP in 2010. And today it's 3.7. You don't want to overstate these things, but it does tell you a lot. Does this feel to you, and more importantly, does it feel to Xi Jinping like a country which is taking on an intense strategic rivalry with the most formidable power it's ever faced? Not at 3.7% of GDP. So there's some very important dissimilarities, all of which to me point towards a contest which is much less stable than the Cold War ended up being. There are also some similarities which are not reassuring. The first similarity that's not reassuring is that, as quickly became apparent in the old Cold War, if it comes to a war, the US can't win at the conventional level. One of the decisive things about the Cold War was that it very rapidly became clear that in a war in Europe against the vast bulk of the Red Army, the United States could not win a conventional war, which is why it had to rely on nuclear weapons and the first use of nuclear weapons. And for a long time, the opposite was the case in Asia, because any significant war in Asia is going to be primarily maritime. The United States has been the dominant maritime power globally for as far as anyone can remember, and China in particular had very weak maritime forces. But today, this is a long story, I won't go into it, but today the United States has lost its assured maritime supremacy as China's capacity to deny it freedom of movement in the Western Pacific has grown very substantially. The second similarity, and what that means is the United States, as it had during the Cold War, a strong imperative to rely on nuclear weapons to achieve what its conventional forces can't achieve. The second unreassuring similarity is that this is a war that's going to be very hard to keep limited. There is a strong argument in the United States, including by some of the most significant strategic thinkers in the United States, that there's good news here, and that is that unlike the Cold War, this war could easily be kept limited. I think there's very little evidence to support that. The stakes for both sides are very high. I think for the reasons I've explained, they're higher for China than they are for the United States, but they are very high. If it's a limited war, it's because the United States, because its stakes are lower, backs off and doesn't win. If the United States doesn't back off, this is not a war that's limited at all. And the third point, the third similarity, which is not reassuring, is that both are nuclear powers, and that the risk of nuclear escalation is very high. One dissimilarity, which is not reassuring, one more dissimilarity that's not reassuring, is that this is not well recognised, at least in the United States. I, at least, am continually surprised by how often people discussing the analogy with the Cold War say one of the differences is that in the Cold War, nuclear weapons were something we really worried about and we don't have to worry about them now. Really? The argument that's often put is that's because China only has 400 nuclear warheads. Well, it's just worth remembering at the time of that is 10%, roughly speaking, of what the United States has. It's just worth remembering that at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union had about 10% of America's nuclear stockpile. But we worried about it a lot. 400 nuclear warheads, even with defences and so on, even with preemptive strikes, can still destroy half a dozen American cities and kill millions of Americans. So, well, taken together, the similarities and differences between the Cold War and the East Asian crisis suggest to me that the East Asian contest we're seeing at the moment is harder for America to win than the Cold War, is more likely to lead to war, is more likely to lead to a nuclear war, and it's more likely that the United States will manage those three facts by withdrawing because its stakes aren't high enough. And that, of course, all has very significant implications for Australia and, for that matter, for our neighbours in Asia. So just back to Ukraine for a minute. The US decision not to fight in Ukraine is still the second most important thing that's happened in the last couple of months. The most important, of course, being Putin's decision to invade. But the US decision not to fight is enormously significant. Because when confronted with the test, is it willing to fight to preserve the military foundation of the post-Cold War global order? The first time it faced that test really seriously by confronting a major power, the answer was no. Now, of course, there's also a test for Putin going on here and a test for Russia, and the outcome of that test is not yet settled. One of the things that's being tested is whether, given that it chose not to fight, the US-led order can be sustained and Putin's use of armed force defeated without going to war by using economic means. Now, all of us who've grown up over the last few decades and have been around this buoy a few times before are inclined to say economic sanctions don't work. And I do, that's my broad hypothesis. But these sanctions are different. Feels a bit different. Maybe this time will be different. And if so, that'll be a very interesting day in the office. But if not, if they can't deliver a decisive defeat to Putin one way or another, and in a reasonable time frame, not weeks or months, but a couple of years, then the failure of that economic mechanism will show that the US lacks the power to sustain the global role it claims. And that will, of course, have immense implications in Asia as well as in Europe. And China will be encouraged to run the same kind of test of US resolve in relation to Taiwan that Putin's running in relation to the Ukraine. And that's something we can learn, just finally, by looking a little bit more closely at what that challenge in Europe really means in Europe. Because if Ukraine is subjugated, then the key question that will face the rest of Europe is that, having failed to prevent Russia reasserting itself as a great power, the question will then be, how does Europe deal with it as a great power? How far does it allow Russia to expand its sphere of influence even further than it will have done, westwards and southwards? Now, these are not new questions. This has been, how far west and south do you allow Russia to go, not just territorially, but in terms of predominant influence, has been one of the principal questions of European statecraft since Peter the Great, since Russia became a great power. And the usual answer, looking at how far west you allow it to go, is halfway through Poland. That's where the Germans, I don't just mean the people of Germany, but the Germans, the Austrians, that's normally where they've said to the Russia, that far and no further. And that's one of the reasons why Poland has got such a shitty history. I mean, you wouldn't laugh if you were Polish. It's that's really the question that Europe faces now. Now, if I was standing in front of a European audience, I have actually done this, and nobody laughs. if you stand in front of a European audience today, the answer they give, the NATO answer, is that we stop it at the NATO boundary, the boundary of the expanded NATO that we see today, which of course includes the Baltic states and Poland and so on. But the problem, particularly in relation to the Baltics, is that they were brought into NATO without serious thought of how hard it would be to defend them and whether it was really necessary for the rest of Europe to defend them. I think it's possible, I'm sure it's possible for NATO to defend the Baltics, but it will be immensely costly. And there is a question as to whether other countries in NATO, the old NATO countries in particular, the ones with the real strategic weight in Western Europe, are willing to bear the burdens of doing that. And so the boundary may be pushed further back, which is bad news for the Baltics. And before we say, no, the Europeans would never do that because they're so committed to the idea of NATO, and they are. There's a real emotional pull in Berlin and Paris and London and Rome to the idea that Brussels, the idea that NATO's new borders have to be sustained. But there's a countervailing factor in what one might call the European strategic psyche, and that is the old idea, which draws on centuries of experience of managing power politics amongst great powers in that very crowded strategic space which is in Europe, which is that great powers have to be given some room. That was the whole idea behind the concept of Europe in the 19th century, for example. And in a different way, it was the idea behind the wacky system that they ran during the 18th century. And so the thought that the boundary might be further back into Europe is not out of the question. But that boundary will have to be drawn somewhere. And wherever it's drawn, it's going to have to be drawn real hard. Against the Russia of today, with a regime that looks anything like Putin's, and it might well be Putin's for a long time to come, then that line, wherever it is going to have to be drawn not with battalions, little token presences, tripwires, but with army corps, permanently deployed right up against the boundary. That really is a new Cold War in that respect. And that is going to be immensely costly and immensely difficult to sustain. Now, and the real question is, who will do that and who will lead? Possibly America will. But the question we've got to ask ourselves is whether, going back to the point I made about America's motives, whether in the long run, not this year or next year, but a decade from now, America will see its imperatives to defend Western Europe as sufficiently important to warrant those costs. Because it is worth bearing in mind, America doesn't have to do it. Europe is strong enough to contain Russia itself, because Europe, the united Europe of today, is immensely strong and much stronger than Russia. Much stronger than Russia. Where it chooses to draw a line, it can stop them if they want to. And so I think there's a fair chance that it won't be America that leads this effort. And if it's not America, it's Germany. And that's a very interesting day in the office for everyone. But, you know, the Chancellor's statements just, 36 hours ago, you know, I mean, lots of things happen that you don't really expect. Well, that's one of them. That's the third most interesting thing that's happened after this Russian movement and the American decision not to invade. So there's a real chance, I think, that we are going to see a strategic revolution in Europe, which will see Europe work very differently, but in a way, just sort of back to the old days, back to giving great powers space and so on. The difference being that Western Europe will be functioning as a single great power. Europe, indeed, will be functioning. The bits that can be kept from Russia will be functioning as a single great power. Okay, very briefly. In Asia, it's different, because the difference in East Asia is that whereas the Europeans, in their new form, with all of that wealth and power and all of that unity which they've built so painfully, and I think, notwithstanding our British friends, so impressively over the years since the end of the Second World War. They are strong enough to contain Russia. But we in East Asia are not strong enough to contain China. If the United States bugs out, then partly because of the sheer economic weight of China compared to the rest of us, it's bigger than the rest of us put together in East Asia, and partly because India won't be part of it, because it's just not close enough. It's not part of the East Asian system. It really has its own strategic system over there in the Indian Ocean and South Asia. India will ensure that China doesn't dominate Asia as a whole, but it won't ensure that it doesn't dominate East Asia. Russia and Europe will ensure that China doesn't dominate Eurasia as a whole. And that's a reminder of how important Russia is always going to be to us, no matter how mad we might be with it today. But the US can live with, because of those things, the US can live with a Chinese-dominated East Asia. So it's a different outcome, different process rather, from what we see in Europe, but the same outcome. As the US does not have the imperative that it used to have to sustain the global order that it promulgated at the end of the Cold War. And so the chances of the US abandoning East Asia, I think, are much higher than most other people do. It was always clear that the great strategic question of at least the early part of the 21st century was whether or how the United States would sustain or would lose the astonishing position of global primacy that it exercised on the 1st of January 2001 at the dawn of the century. And for a decade now, we've seen the pressures on the United States, on its capacity to sustain that order, building. And now they have broken out in very dramatic terms. And it does seem to me that the Cold War provides no very helpful guide and no very reassuring evidence as to what happens next. Thank you very much.
These are the 7 most powerful men in China. They represent the top leadership positions of the ruling party, and their identities are revealed every 5 years at a carefully choreographed political event called the National Congress.
China's Communist Party unveils its new leadership over the next 5 years.
The order of appearance is symbolic. The first person to emerge is the head of the party for the next 5 years. At the most recent event in October 2022, that person was Xi Jinping, China's president for the last 10 years. Who walked out in the top spot a historic 3rd time after getting rid of China's presidential term limit that restricted all his predecessors to 2 terms. A signal that he may be planning to stay in power for life. The world hasn't seen a Chinese leader like this since Mao Zedong, the revolutionary founder of the People's Republic of China, whose ruthless dictatorship scarred the Chinese people for generations. Xi has been compared to Mao a lot, and he clearly draws from Mao's playbook. But there's something else that connects these two. When Xi was just a young boy, Mao ruined his life. Generations apart, their paths crossed unexpectedly, and a teenage Xi from an elite family in Beijing ended up in exile, condemned to